bookstore. And so that was a treat. And then we headed down to Portland and read at Annie Bloom's together. And in particular, that reading was really fun, partially because my high school principal was there.
Oh.
And she asked a lot of questions. And she was just so proud of me. It was such a great experience to see her. And, you know, I realized through this it's just way better to read with another author. I really have appreciated that. And it's just more fun. And I've loved discovering kind of the kindred things about our books, and of course learning more about Will Starling and your creative process, which has been really inspiring. So yeah, I'm sad that this is our last stop on our tour together.
You'll have to do another one.
Yeah, I mean maybe.
Well, we can be like old rock and rollers. We just keep coming back.
Maybe so.
So do a farewell tour after
Yeah,
farewell tour.
exactly. The Stone, farewell tours with the Stones done by this point.
So my book, Among the Wonderful, chronicles the rise and fall of P.T. Barnum's first enterprise, this labyrinthine museum that he ran for some time as a young man in Lower Manhattan. Will, you could probably give a good description of the book.
Oh, you want me to do my pitch?
That would be, I'd like to hear it actually.
It's a one-line elevator pitch.
And so the main characters are a taxidermist and a giantess. And my reason for choosing them is that I became obsessed, fascinated with this imagined idea of this moment that modern entertainment was born in America. And it all came about when I started reading this early edition of P.T. Barnum's autobiography, because his voice is so clearly one of a trickster, like a mythological trickster figure that just wants to, you know, really just trick people and make money, and he was just this person on the threshold of the modern age. So, but he was almost too fantastical to make into a fictional character. So I decided to create him as a true trickster, and instead of focusing on his psyche, focus on those of two of his employees. One who really does not want the Age of Wonders to end. Well, they both don't want the Age of Wonders to end. But the taxidermist in particular, he's just clinging on to this idea that the world can be categorized tidily, and that and more personally, he wants to stay within this world of static objects that he just adores, but that are not alive. And the giantess really is a living wonder in and of herself, a successful businesswoman who's made made her livelihood out of her unusual height, and but knows that she does not have very long to live in terms of her physicality. So she's kind of she's breaking down. So I wanted to just read a little bit from the book, and you know, the book's been out for a few years, and there's a character that in hindsight I wish maybe I'd developed a little bit more. The writer's, confession. But so I thought I'd just drop in this point in the book. It's chapter 5, so it's not very far into it, but and you can get to know her as well. But here we find the taxidermist, Emile Guilledot, and he Barnum essentially came in and bought the museum where he'd been working for his whole life. The former owner, John Scudder, was Guilledot's benefactor, best friend, father figure, you name it. And then Guilledot's devastated when he sells this collection of almost 1,000 taxidermied, specimens, his life's work, to this trickster, this rascal, this person that he thinks is going to destroy. Well, you'll hear his lament for sure. So Scudder's the former owner. And we meet him, he's out among the exhibits. We meet Emile Guilledot, the taxidermist. He's fled his office out of frustration, of course. He's very grumpy. And he's seeking solace in one of his favorite exhibits. Okay. The small orb with its emerald and indigo pattern of continent and sea, hung against a painted firmament. Guido did not mind this diminutive view of Earth, although this exhibit had caused a ripple of controversy when Scudder first unveiled it. Nor was he bothered by what the rendering made obvious. Any notion of the heft and volume of the highest mountain range or the deepest oceanic trench was a simple illusion. The planet hung without an anchor, free and unprotected in the void, susceptible to cosmic forces of which man would never conceive. To view this scene, Guido had discovered when he first peered through the brass viewer labeled Scipio's Dream, was to take part in a strange charade. Here the whole earthly world was represented, but the whole vista encompassed no more than a foot of space within a single room of a labyrinthine museum that was just one building on a quadrant of buildings making up one block in one neighborhood in a city on a small island in the, "What's this?" A familiar voice accompanied a quick tap on his shoulder. Guido pulled away from the brass viewer to find Edie Scudder with her hands on her hips. "Just a shell of the former man, eh?" She smiled. "What are you doing here?" In his sudden elation, the paradox of Scipio's dream spun off into the ether. "I received an invitation from Barnum to join his staff for lunch today." Edie Scudder's wiry brown hair fell loose around her shoulders, despite the fashion of the day. She wore a fitted velvet jacket and a cobalt blue skirt, though there was a streak of tar along the hem. Edie spent most days near the ships and had picked up everything from tattoos to foul language. She had long ago learned to censor herself with Guido, and now she patted him on the back and hooked her arm through his. He looked tired. "I've become the keeper of a squealing menagerie." She laughed, and several museum visitors turned their heads. I should say, Barnum has brought live animals into the museum. Maybe that's clear, but to the taxidermist, that's just like, the ultimate insult. Guido had always hoped that Edie, John Scudder's only child and a natural businesswoman, would take over the management of the collection when the time came. But her interest was in shipping, and as unlikely as it seemed, she was proving very successful at it. "It's not funny," he said. Her lightheartedness suddenly made his disappear. "On Thursday, a man delivered 3 parrots to the kitchen instead of my office. By the time I got there, they were already on their way to the restaurant. The chef had wrung their necks and plucked them." Edie laughed harder. "It was not funny. I've got to do something." "Barnum's got big ideas, Emile." Edie looked around the crowded Cosmorama salon, and it looks like they're working. "But some division must be made between the specimens and the living. It's simply not right to stumble upon a live serpent when you think you're in a room full of stuffed ducks, for God's sake." Edie hooted again and slapped him lightly on the arm. "That's not right, is it? Not acceptable at all." Edie rarely came here anymore. She was 20 years his junior, which made her approaching 35. But when he looked at her, Guido saw each stratum of her girlhood. His life enveloped hers. He'd been in her father's employ since the day she was born. She used to confide in him as he worked across from her. Opposite whatever specimen he stretched, scraped, or sewed, she would carefully spread her own work. Sometimes it was a tray of shells, sometimes a box of agates. Sometimes it was schoolwork, and sometimes her own sketches, kept safe in a notebook that he had given her on her 7th birthday. His affection for Edie was never paternal. Even then, when she was 7 and he was 27, he regarded her with a combination of delight and impatience. If only she could grow up faster, or he'd go backward to meet her on equal ground. He hung back during her adolescence, watching periods of bravado give way to interminable solitary walks in her father's galleries. She still told him things during this period about her friends and the places she'd visited. She told him what she would not tell her father, and yet he still waited. He had endured several periods of romantic longing, the first during Edie's 15th year. He considered this a natural evolution. It was a love that opened its arms wide to the child he had known. He considered his feelings respectful, reverential. He believed it would not be long before they reached their final and permanent mode relating as lifelong companions. But in that peculiar way that lives diverge as sharply and decisively as an incision, soon after her 23rd birthday, Edie eloped with a naval captain. When her outraged father told him the news, Guido felt as if lightning had ignited every atom in his body. The gap between them, always wider than he would have liked, snapped open once and for all. What else could he do but swallow his hope that they would marry? Within the year, he had married Celia, the daughter of his favorite bookseller.
It's documentary.
Edie led Guido out of the viewing salon up into the main fourth floor galleries. There was a new exhibit in a case built in the style of all the vitrines of the museum, with wood moldings carved in various designs. But this case did not contain shelves. It was filled with water, and in the water were 20 little creatures that seemed to glide and float on springs. Their tails were coiled like fiddleheads below them, and they maintained themselves relatively upright. The specimens of Hippocampus zosteri had arrived just 2 days earlier, and Guido had been all over town until he found a Chinese mercantile on 3rd Avenue that sold tiny dried shrimp, which the swimming creatures darted after and inhaled with gusto. The strange feathery fish just drifted up and down, sometimes twining their tails around one another like schoolchildren holding hands, and generally addressing the world with a kissing motion. Look at them, said Edie. Where are they from? Who knows? Guido tried to remain annoyed. How does he get seawater in here? That was one of the first things he did. We all wondered why, but he built a pipe to the harbor right away. Must have cost a fortune. How does he pump the water? Guido shrugged. Must have bribed the alderman. The octopus was the first to arrive. It's in Gallery 14, but I think I'll have to move it. Is it near your stuffed ducks? Edie laughed. Oh, stop. Please, these are serious problems and not just taxonomic. When your father ran the place, I was invited to every important auction in the city. The zoological societies, hunting clubs, every respectable private collector, all the government expedition companies. I had access to all the specimens coming into the city. I thought I might even be close to receiving an invitation from the Lyceum. But now, let me describe it this way. Yesterday, a servant showed up at my office with the corpse of some kind of cat, a spotted cat. It was larger than a house cat, about the size of a raccoon, wrapped in a sack. Ultimately, I determined it was Felis jaguarundi from South America. The man told me that his mistress had received the cat as a gift from a friend who had just returned from a government expedition to the Amazon. Exotic pets are common in certain circles, and those pets very often die. I soon discovered that Barnum has offered a small sum for each of these creatures. It's a low practice, completely illegitimate in my field. It's awful. And the cat was far too decomposed to mount. Edie took his arm again. I'm so sorry, I know. They soon reached the electric eel safely pickled in its jar, as it had been for 20 years. Hello, old friend, Edie whispered. Indeed. They regarded the eel. I want to see the roof, Emile, said Edie. Will you take me up there? Scudder had never opened the roof to the public. It's a liability, he'd said. Naturally, it was the first place Barnum wanted to go after he bought the museum. Barnum, 25 years younger than Guido and fueled by disconcerting confidence, had walked onto the roof, raised his arms as if about to conjure a storm, and slowly rotated, taking in the view of the buildings in the harbor. My Ark of the City, he proclaimed. The vast rooftop held a miniature English garden with potted laurels and even a patch of grass, planted on a raised pedestal that framed the view of the harbor. Along the southern edge was a promenade, complete with inlaid brick, balloon vendors, and scattered stone and wooden benches. Even now, in the cold beginning of spring, groups of visitors walked the periphery, weaving among bedecked flagpoles and leaving puffs of white breath in their wakes. The restaurant spread northward from the midpoint of the roof. Most of the patrons had moved their chairs close to the freestanding stoves placed throughout the restaurant on cooler days, and waiters moved between them in the large kitchen on the northern edge. But as Guido and Edie emerged from the stairwell, what caught their eyes was a crowd gathered near the center of the garden, pressing its collective nose against a huge, new wrought iron cage. When they approached, Edie read the placard, "The Happy Family?" A coyote paced the length of the cage, picking its way around 3 ground squirrels sitting on their hind legs. A peregrine falcon with tattered tail feathers hunched on the ground, and mice scurried near its feet. A house cat sat in the corner like a loaf of bread, the coyote not even looking at it as it paced. A dead forked tree leaned against one side of the cage where a corn snake lay asleep, like a pile of yellow rope. Above the snake was a mottled gray owl. Look, In front of them, a little girl called to her mother. "The dog doesn't eat the cat," she laughed and pointed. Guido could not interpret Edie's fixed smile. "Nature did not intend this," he said ominously. "Where did you think you bought it?" "From someone who apparently found perverting nature a fine entertainment. They've been trained out of their own natures." Guido watched the coyote gliding the length of the cage. It turned like a swimmer, barely brushing the corner with its tail. The dog watched the people looking in. The children squealed at the falcon and the mouse. Edie read the inscription on a brass plaque. The divine pleasure saw to it that there was a great peace among the animals. The lion did not hurt the unicorn, nor the falcon the dove. Touché, Barnum. Guido looked away. "Maybe you're the one being presumptuous, Emile," Edie said, stepping back from the cage. "We all play God now and then, even you. Especially you, my dear." "Edith, really, that's not true. Just think about what this place is, Emile. It's not a natural history museum anymore." "But what is it?" "That," she was laughing again, "couldn't tell you, but the children are smiling, and so am I." As they approached the group of employees sitting at a large table near the edge of the restaurant, Edie ran ahead to embrace William the ticket man and his nephew, Gideon. "Well," said Edie, "how do you like the new museum?" "I like it just fine," said William, taking out his watch and checking the time. "We had a record number of visitors yesterday, and it's going to keep getting better." "Have some wine, Emile." Edie poured them both a glass and raised hers. "To the happy family." The wind flicked the red and blue flags on their poles and set the rooftop trees rustling. A hat flew into the air, and a group of children chased it until it sailed beyond the edge of the building. Another surge lifted the corner of the tablecloth, upsetting 2 wine glasses and blowing Guido's napkin away. They waited for Barnum, but Barnum did not appear. Thank you.
Splendid. Those who haven't yet had a chance to read Stacey's novel, Women the Wonderful, I really urge you to do so. It is a splendid novel. It's absolutely gorgeous. Thank you so much for being here. Dana, thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you for inviting us. It's a wonderful store. Yeah, so I'm delighted to be here this evening. Yes, I'm here with Will Starling, my second novel. I started out as a stage playwright many long years ago in a different geological era entirely, and then spent the better part of a quarter century working primarily in TV and film, and sort of had one of those midlife Damascene conversions. Late midlife Damascene conversions to writing novels. My first novel actually was written shortly after I turned 50. I had a chance to start working on a novel. One of those odd things, a commission from a publisher. It was one of those that I'd been thinking about writing a novel for ever since I'd been a graduate student. And for those who've turned 50, and some of the room have done this rash thing along with me, one finds that it focuses the mind quite wonderfully. You kind of think to yourself, if there are things I really want to try, I should probably get around to trying them, instead of saying that at some future point in time, when the stars align and when I have a more convenient schedule, I may get around to doing this. So in any case, the novel was Daniel Thunder, and Will Starling is the follow-up. Not a sequel, but set like Daniel Thunder in the 19th century in London, which is my favorite city in the whole wide world. It's set amongst the surgeons and grave robbers in 1816 London. The novel is primarily narrated by Will Starling, the title character, who's a 19-year-old surgeon's assistant who returns from 5 years assisting a military surgeon during the Napoleonic Wars, which was an era in which surgery, we've all had a chance to digest our supper, I'm sure. Surgery had made extraordinary advances during the Napoleonic Wars, even though they didn't have such niceties as anesthetic or any knowledge of germ theory. Lister and germ theory didn't come along until the late 1850s. But leaving aside things like that, a whole generation of military surgeons had become extraordinarily adept at a limited number of procedures because they've had this vast amount of practice as battlefield surgeons during Napoleonic campaigns. I mean, there are reports of Dominic Jean Leray, who was Napoleon's battlefield surgeon. Apparently, after the Battle of Burgos, in a 24-hour period, performed nearly 200 amputations, which gives an indication of the rate of speed they worked at. But you sort of extend that over several years' work. And they got very good at it. But there was also an extraordinary explosion in all of the sciences at the time. From about 1875 onwards, modern science was really being born. There was in the fields of chemistry, botany, biology, you name it, and astronomy. There were huge advances being made. There was an era of great excitement in the air. That's part of the excitement that Will Starling walks into when he arrives back in London after Waterloo in 1815. He also arrives in the London of Regency abandon. Lord Byron is basically Britain's first rock star, as it were, with the publication of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, the first installment in 1812. He's mobbed wherever he goes. Women are posting underwear to him. Yes. Edmund Kean is revolutionizing the theater. He's the first of the great, so-called romantic actors, doing away with the old neoclassical style of acting, which was based on stateliness and decorum. It was Edmund Kean, whom Samuel Taylor Coleridge memorably said that watching him act is like reading Shakespeare by flashes of lightning. He was also, if you imagine every rock and roll excess, rolled up into one and magnified by 10, you kind of got Edmund Kean. He drank himself to death as a young man. But apparently, during his performances, he would need several bottles of wine to get him through the performance. In those days, there were also intervals between the acts, between each act of a Shakespearean play. So he needed a bottle of wine for each interval. He also tended to need a different prostitute for each interval, and managed to keep that up for some years until he actually died on stage in his son's arms. His son was also an actor. Kean collapsed on stage. It was in his.
About how old do you think he was?
He was in his 40s, so he lasted that long. but no longer.
Wow, I'm impressed.
Yes. In any case, among the other advances that were taking place, there was a great deal of research into the mechanism of death. They didn't understand at the time what death actually was. I mean, they knew what it was to be dead, but they hadn't yet figured out what the actual process was. What causes a living being to become dead. There were various attempts to revive corpses, some of which had been demonstrably dead for quite some time. Using electricity, using galvanism, well publicized attempts to do so. 1816 was, by coincidence, the year Mary Shelley began writing Frankenstein. In that remarkable summer vacation she took in Switzerland with Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley and John Polidori and Claire Claremont and some others. She was reacting to what was going on in the realm of scientific exploration at the time. To my knowledge, nobody actually tried, as Dr. Frankenstein does, to sew together a corpse, various corpses, and invent a new creature. But there certainly were attempts to revive. Will Starling grows convinced, or is convinced, coming into the telling of the story, that one of London's leading surgical lights, a man named Dionysius Atherton, is involved in the most unholy research. Will, as we discover, is not the world's most reliable narrator. There are things he's not telling us. There's things he's not telling us about his own involvement with some of these things. But he's convinced that he must tell us, his readers, what Dionysius Atherton has done. We begin to realize that Will is writing while in prison. We'll find out what it was that got him there. He's waiting at great haste, trying to get the story out. I'll read a brief passage, just one brief passage this evening. It has to do with a couple of nights earlier, a man named Bob Eldridge had choked to get to death at a theatrical orgy involving Edmund Kean and others. Dionysus Atherton, the surgeon, was there, tried to save the man, bring him back by conventional means, tracheotomy, pumping the lungs with a bellows, couldn't do it. Bob Eldridge seems to have been demonstrably dead. Atherton then called for a carriage. He was going to take Bob Eldridge back, the corpse of Bob Eldridge, back to his house at Crushed Friars, and does not say what he's going to do there. Will, a couple of days after that, bumps into, on the street, a woman named Philippa Deakins, who was a servant in Atherton's house at Crushed Friars. She has seen horrors, she says. Will finally has a witness who can attest to what Atherton has been doing. His problem is twofold. Philippa Deakins is, among other things, a religious fanatic who is haunted by strange, consuming guilt of her own, which she's not forthcoming about. She's also a laudanum addict. And is convinced that every night when she walks up the stairs to bed, it's
Like morphine or?
it's opium and milk,
Oh.
which is drunk. She's convinced that when she walks up the stairs to bed, a man in a turban with green eyes leaps out from the shadows and bites her on the arm. However, she's his witness. I'll read a brief passage. They're sitting at a public house, and he's taken her to a pub. Bought her a drink to calm her nerves, and she's going to tell him what she saw. She had heard the coach arrive outside, she said, in a clattering of hoofs. Odenkirk, Atherton's man, had hurried to meet it. Miss Deakins recognized his voice, and moments later she glimpsed him through the window, holding up a lantern and gesturing as he led the way across the stable yard behind the house. In the shaft of light there were 3 men, lugging something limp and heavy. Mr. Atherton was with them. Miss Deakins heard his voice, exhorting them to be quick. It had been close to 40 minutes, she heard him saying. 40 minutes? Odenkirk's voice, uncertain what Atherton meant. I won't do the accents, by the way. Pretend you're hearing English accents. 40 minutes, Odenkirk's voice, uncertain what Atherton meant. Since the man has been dead, so there may yet be time. Hurry. The stable bulked in the darkness beyond. Flitty Deakins lived in mortal trembling in that stable. No doubt it had once been used as nature intended for the keeping of horses, but Mr. Atherton kept other creatures instead, outlandish beasts, peacocks and sloths and cassowaries, and some whose identity she could not even guess at. She could hear them at all hours. They haunted her nightmares, and once in the creeping light of dawn she had awakened in her bed to see the face of Belial staring at her through the window. Her screams had petrified Cook and brought Mr. Atherton himself at a half run. He had barked at her until she was able to stammer a description, at which she left again in a color, calling to Odenkirk that the baboon had escaped. It was a serious matter, Odenkirk had later told her with a chuckle. The creature was dangerous. Dangerous? I told him, Mr. Starling, I said to him, the creature is not dangerous. The creature is one of the 4 princes of hell itself, Mr. Odenkirk, drawn here by the wickedness of this house. Oh, Mr. Starling, dear young Mr. Starling, you can have no idea what that house is like. In fact, I knew very well what went on in surgeons' houses, living as I did in one myself. Mr. Comrie had no stable to fill with creatures for anatomical study, and he was never as active as was Atherton in transactions with the resurrection man. But from time to time, there were the same nighttime doings in Cripplegate as haunted Miss Deakins. Thumps and muffled curses on the stair, rough men in moleskins arriving in darkness with burdens tied up in sacks to be hidden till the donkey cart should arrive to transport them to the death house for dissection. Miss Deakins must surely have known this, but perhaps her need for a friend was so very great, any friend at all, even if it be a surgeon's boy she'd seen no more than 5 times in her life, that she invented in her head quite a different Will Starling and poured out to him her poor heart. She wasn't old. Not yet 30 was my guess, though her hair was streaked with silver and her face was already gaunt with the habit of laudanum. But there at the Duck and Dolphin, in the writhing shadows cast by firelight, she might have been a beldam in a cave. The stable, she whispered. I saw them take him, the corpse, for that's what it was. I knew this at once, Mr. Starling, as surely as I'm sitting here before you. They carried the mortal remains of a human creature. There was a loft in the stable at the top of a wooden ladder, accessible by a trap door that was kept padlocked and bolted. Flitty Deacons had not seen this with her eyes, as she would not set foot in that stable, but others had. There were whispers. And there was a small cracked window in the loft, behind which Miss Deacons had from time to time glimpsed movement. Now she saw dark figures moving in the light of Odenkirk's lantern. They were laying something out upon a table. I stood as one astonished, Mr. Starling, astonied, turned to stone in the true original meaning of that word. She knew such things, for she had been a governess with 2 bright angels in her care. And where were you, Miss Deacons? The question took her off balance. In Devonshire, Mr. Starling, as I have said before. I meant, where were you standing 2 nights ago as you watched? Because I wanted to be clear in my head. Even there at the Duck and Dolphin, so near the start of it all, I had the sense that I must be clear in my head. I was standing in the bedchamber, of course. I had been wakened by the voices and went to the window. But I had a notion that the servants' quarters at Friars faced south and east. Such was my quick calculation based on the very few times I'd been inside, and not north towards the stable. Atherton's surgery was at the back of the house, however, on the 2nd floor. His surgery, where laudanum would be kept. I looked at her closely. She didn't seem opium-addled just now, though of course you could never tell for certain with those lungs long sunk in the habit. She clutched her glass of pale in both hands, gazing down in such fixed distress that you'd think she could see the events of that night reflected in the surface like the portents in a gypsy's crystal. So, she crept down the corridor to prig to stop her brown bottle from Atherton's surgery. I pictured her reaching towards the cabinet in the twisting light of her candle. Then the sound of the carriage, Miss Deacons freezes. Voices from outside draw her in fearful fascination to the window. And what did you see? I said. Miss Deacons closed her eyes. She drew a quavering breath to steady herself. I saw an arm rising up. I don't understand what you mean, but I've begun to guess. The first cold intimations commenced to spider up my spine. They'd been busy about the body, she said, the corpse in the loft upon the table. They'd been doing things, Odenkirk and Mr. Atherton. What things? She could not say. She did not choose to imagine. Then they stepped back. There was a sudden flash of light. It lit the loft for a flickering instant, and she saw them revealed like players upon a stage. Then the arm rose up. The dead man's arm. Yes. They raised the dead man's arm. Oh no. The dead man raised it himself. It should have been midnight, as she told me this. We should have been wreathed in yellow fog. She leaned closer, her eyes fever bright. He lifted his arm, Mr. Starling. He reached out like a lost soul reaching from the grave. And then it fell. The arm fell back down. But there was another flash, and it rose again, the fingers moving, this time clenching. Miss Deacons saw commotion from the others in that flash, dark figures herk a jerk. And then there was another flash. The arm rose up again. No, Mr. Starling. Oh no, poor dear Mr. Starling. If that were all an arm, then Miss Deacons might yet hope to sleep again. The 3rd time, he rose up. The man who was lying on the table. He lurched perpendicular, sat there in the flash of light, and then turned his head. With hair on end and eyes like eggs, he stared across the night at Philida Deacons. And then he shrieked. Oh, Mr. Starling, oh, that cry. Such a shriek of desolation as would haunt the rest of her life through all the nights that lay ahead. It would pursue her through all the winding byways of this world and hound her gibbering at last, she swore it would, to the gates of Bedlam Hospital. Such a shriek as would not be heard again until the dead rose up at the end of days to face the awful reckoning. As she clutched my wrist with both her hands, it grew clear enough to me now, if I'd ever doubted it to begin with. Lady Deacons was mad, deranged, and an opium addict into the bargain, a woman beset by green-eyed men on the landing. But what if what she said was true? The question whispered itself with a scrotum-tightening intensity. What happened afterwards? The man sat up, you say. The corpse, you say he looked at you, but then... I I trailed away. Miss Deakins was shrinking as she gazed past my shoulder. I turned to see a man lounging against a wooden post behind us, a long gray man with a smile slashed across his face. "Why, ain't this just the prettiest pair?" said Odenkirk. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I have a question for you.
Sure.
So, one of the things that just completely blew me away about Will Starling was the incredible use of slang. I know I've asked you this before, but I just want you to go a little bit more into how, because the wonderful language, the vernacular of this period of London that he uses in this book is just mind-blowing. I mean, I went to my computer many times. That can't be a real word or a saying, and they all, are these gems, and yet they're just used in perfect context. And so, can you illuminate a little bit? I mean, how did you do that?
Spent a lot of time there.
Yes. Thank you, by the way. Yeah, yes, I've spent quite a lot of time in London. In terms of the research for the novel, the novel evolved over 5 years, and there was 2 years of research before I started writing at all, and then it was sort of going back and forth between research and writing. And what I tried to do in the first analysis was to bless you. Yes. To basically to steep myself in anything I could find that had been written during the period. Of course, Egan, writers like that are a particularly wonderful source. Egan was not, quote unquote, a literary writer. He wasn't a novelist, but he was a tremendously popular writer, a journalist. He wrote some famous pieces about boxing, for instance. Replete with Regency slang. So basically, to begin with, starting out, just casting the net fairly wide as far as what was written during the period. But there's also collections of slang terms, which begin to be published from about just after 1815 onwards, up until the 1860s. And there's whole levels of slang. There's the slang involved, flash language, which was the language of the underworld, which evolved essentially so that the police wouldn't be able to tell what they were talking about if they were around in a tavern. There was costermonger slang, which was kind of the forerunner of Cockney slang. The slang of the street sellers, and every sort of section of society had its own slang. And also, one of the wonderful things about England even now, is that there's a delight in the sounds of language. And when you read contemporary documents from the 19th century, people spoke in very distinctive ways, and sometimes in very lyrical ways. Even Samuel Johnson's dictionary contains some nice talk about geeks, sitting, reading my Penguin Samuel Johnson's dictionary before going to bed. But there's some of the language in the dictionary. Has passed out of use. The wonderful word "merd Uranus," for instance, occurs in Johnson's dictionary.
What word is that?
Merd Uranus, the French merde for ship.
Yeah.
So put the two together, get Merd Uranus, which describes the rivers in London at the time, since they were basically they were open sewers.
Yeah.
Boy.
So tell me about the research for Among the Wonderful.
Well, let's see. It really started when I read P.T. Barnum's earliest autobiography. That's what set me on the trail. And when I fully, decided, okay, I'm going to write about this museum, this early, kind of the enterprise through which he made his first million and made his name in New York. I went back to newspapers. Well, I was living in New York for 2 years while I wrote the first draft of this novel. I was in graduate school in the MFA program, so I had access to the New York Public Library, New York Historical Society, and also this wonderful early circus museum in Somers, New York? I think Somers, New York. And so again, like you, I went back to primary documents of the time, and so the newspapers. I mean, it was the age of the penny paper in New York. So just reading the microfiche newspapers of the time, 1838 to 41, really I think gave me the gumption, or gave me the gumption and just a textural feeling of the atmosphere of New York that I wanted to create. I mean, it was just murders and I mean we were talking about this before the reading, but the papers were so salacious and just, you know,
And I love in your book too how you describe New York wasn't built up as far, you know, uptown as it is, and so once you walked out of a certain area very close to the downtown section, you were in farmland
that was
and
actually
country.
sort of the most fun research,
Which was so neat. It's so neat to me how it just becomes green and country in what is now like Midtown.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was fun to go back and try to research based on you know, British when the British occupied the upper half of Manhattan during the Revolutionary War. You know, they had some naturalist types who chronicled the wildlife that they saw and everything, types of fish that were in the ponds and lakes there, and so, you know, I did that sort of research as well. It was very interesting. Could have been very consuming. I had to stop myself at a certain point. But the only other thing I'll say about the research is, if you read my book, you'll
Everyone will
hear about. Yeah, of course, that's right. Well, when you get to the part when, so the giantess character Anna is kind of obsessed with writing her own story, and I was inspired by that when I went to this early circus museum, and they had this old box, basically. I mean, I couldn't even believe it wasn't archived better, but they had a box of pamphlets from it was more like the very end of the 19th century, but they were just things you would have bought at you know, a later version of Barnum's museum. He rebuilt his museum several times over the third quarter of the 19th century. But anyway, one of the things that I was able to just pick up and look at was the true life history of a giant that was on display, a person of unusual height. And this was a pamphlet that you could buy when you know, went to see them. And so it was called The True Life History, and it was just like these fabricated vignettes some about giants in general, giants in history and literature, the Bible, and then some of it was like this story about the giant's upbringing. And that when I found that, I knew that I wanted to have some text within the text in the form of her true life history. I think it appealed to me on so many levels, like, you know, that she could be something of a scribbler, you know, having the opportunity to write her own story or self-mythologize instead of having somebody else telling it. So that was one, I think, probably my favorite discovery during the research process, was that pamphlet and sort of putting it together and being so inspired by that.
So there's obviously well, taxidermy. There's the taxidermy connection. I mean, you know, even in a way, and your things are being patched together. You know, dead bodies are being dealt with in both books, and that is interesting. Even though you're dealing with, you know, very different times and people and places and stuff, that there is that connection. There's dead bodies all over these.
Dead bodies.
Yes.
No, I
And you
noticed
have in
too.
that dreams, one of my another favorite part with the dream sequence with the wife being taxidermy and coming back.
Yeah, I guess that would be the
Oh.
Yeah, it really connects
Oh.
then. With
One thing
like
I
that.
was thinking about relatedly is the role of the cabinet of curiosities. There's a cabinet of curiosities that's in sort of the inner chamber of Dionysius Atherton, the surgeon, and you know, Barnum's museum is sort of a cabinet of wonders as well. And so I was thinking about that and how I felt like in your book, this cabinet of wonders, it would be somebody who had like seen it through a doorway, this jars of maybe who knows what, fetuses and, you know, severed arm and all this stuff. It was this this really a sense of horror that it evoked in people, you know, and it's like this horror of death and what happens to your body after you die and everything. And in the I mean, very different sort of flavor, but
Absolutely.
in my book, but I did note that too, like this.
Yeah.
I don't know if you.
No, for sure. There was Every time I move on the chair, it squeaks. That's not me, by the way.
Okay. We were wondering.
No, it's something to do with the gentleman in my pants. It's the truth. Yeah. No, yeah.
You're turning red.
Well, yes, well.
Hard jokes.
No, well. Yeah. No, the room actually that shows up in the novel, in Atherton's collection room, is actually based on the museum which now exists of the collection of John Hunter, which is available. If you go to London, there's the Royal Hunterian Museum at the College of Physicians and Surgeons.
Is he he was a famous
He was the so-called father of modern surgery.
Oh.
His name again, Will?
John Hunter.
And what's in the museum?
The museum is based around the collection he amassed during his lifetime. Because the pioneering surgeons were all anatomists and comparative anatomists. They were working a lot on animals. And of course, that doesn't come into the novel at all. I couldn't find any way of dealing with vivisection without sending myself screaming from the room, so that isn't even mentioned. But he's basically, Hunter, over the course of his career, amassed this huge collection of anatomical oddities. Bits and parts in jars, animal and human, and it's this vast room in London, which is lined floor to ceiling with these specimens. So I sort of borrowed that image. And John Hunter was also the first one to collaborate on an organized basis with the grave robbers, with the Resurrection Movement. Yeah, because at the time, up until 1832, unlike the situation that existed in Europe, in Great Britain, surgeons and anatomists had no legal recourse to corpses, which they needed for research. For anatomical research, they needed to cut things apart to find out how they worked, because the only other way to do it was on living patients, while they were doing the operation. Which of course, would happen as well. But so that this whole world of grave robbers sprang up, organized gangs who play a significant role in the novel. But
They'd stop over and say, "Can you use a little?"
Yes, there were certain pubs around London where the most notorious one was the Fortune of War, which is the Fortune of War Tavern. Yeah, it's by Smithfields. It's just if you know London geography at all, if you go north of St Paul's Cathedral and walk for half a mile, you're in the maze of streets. That's where the tavern would have stood. But yeah, the grave robbers would lay out their wares in a back room on planks and tables.
Like in the alleyway, or where?
It was actually inside the pub. In the Fortune of War, they would, because it was very close to St. Bart's Hospital, St. Bartholomew's Hospital, and the surgeons would come over and check what was on offer.
Must be a guy thing.
But it was £4 for a corpse in good condition, an adult corpse.
Lord.
Smaller corpses came in 4 sizes. They were large, small, and fetus. The smalls were priced out by the inch. Those were
Oh
children.
my God. And what did people do with them?
They were.
The doctors.
Okay.
They just
Okay.
cut them up.
Yeah.
And they didn't ask too closely into how they came to die. Marks of violence were commonly overlooked by the surgeons and anatomists, and they would buy the corpses, which ultimately led to the passages of the Anatomy Act in 1832, which basically made it legal to use the corpses of poor people for dissection. A typical early Victorian approach to a social issue. But what had happened was that the grave robbers, as they grew more enterprising, and as competition grew fiercer, the grave robbers realized that waiting till someone was dead and then digging him up was really the least effective way of acquiring a corpse. It was much better if you came across the corpse while it was still wide awake and whistling. And so there was some highly publicized murders tied to the grave robbers, which created a Burke and Hare in Edinburgh.
Yes.
They were
Yes.
they were inviting people back home to a party and then smothering them. And in London, one of the turning point was there was a famous case in 1831, the so-called Italian boy, and there's a riff on that character appears actually in Will Starling. But the grave robbers killed someone cute. or they were blamed for it. Always a mistake. They were blamed for it. It would seem that they actually weren't involved, but the tabloid, the forerunner of the tabloid press was convinced that the grave robbers had killed the Italian boy, who was this cute little boy, an Italian immigrant beggar, who had a white mice in a cage, and he would sort of beg on the corner with his white mice, and he disappeared. And when he went missing, and people were convinced the grave robbers had done it, that was finally the impetus towards the passage of the Anatomy Act. That we can't have this tradition continuing. So after 1832, there was some grave robbing, but it really didn't pay much anymore, because the corpses, those who died in poorhouses and those who died in hospitals and weren't claimed by family members could be given over to the surgeons.
Isn't it the same year the police were formally created, 1832?
The Peelers, Robert Peel. We think of the police forces going back a long ways, but it really wasn't. I mean, the modern London Conservator begins right then. Before that, there were the constables, basically. There were Bow Street runners who were kind of thugs working for the side of the law, as opposed to sometimes working both sides of the street. But there were parish constables.
Well, that's true. There aren't really any police in this tale, Will Starling.
No. Yeah,
It's more like the watchmen at the
Yes.
Were they the
cemeteries.
watchmen calling out the time?
the watchmen
Kind
calling
of,
at the
where they
time.
were really guardians, or they would keep their eye out for?
They were supposed to, but they were notoriously incompetent. I mean, they were.
Hi. Hi.
There was no training. They were notorious for drinking a great deal.
Oh, and the night watch.
Yes, and they
Drinking,
had,
boozing.
drinking a great deal, and they were. They had their booths that the watchmen had a sort of a box which they sat in before making their hourly rounds. They were famous for getting drunk and falling asleep inside the box.
In the box.
Yeah. At which point, gangs of drunks would come along and push them over.
Oh my God.
Pierce Egan makes a big deal of that. And
What characters?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's the thing. I mean, the Regency is just rife with these wonderful characters.
Yeah.
Well, this leads to, because we're getting to the point where we probably have to stop and do
go ahead.
things after all this death and destruction. Of course. What are you guys working on next? Because I hope they're like nice, light, frothy comedies.
No.
Pretty much.
I'm actually working on what's kind of a revisionist Western with a Southern Gothic dimension, which takes place in part in San Francisco in the early 1890s.
Wow.
So,
Wow. That'll make a change.
yes.
Can't wait to read that.
And Stacey?
I'm working on a book set in the far north that's about a Russian Orthodox monk who wants to be the northernmost holy man in the world. So it's about failed ambition. Among other things.
Spoiler alert. Wow. Well, that's different. That's incredibly different. Yeah.
It's very different, yeah.
Thank you guys both. This has been fascinating.
wonderful.
So if anybody would like to purchase you can't purchase Stacey's book, but if you're interested based on the reading, but you can purchase this man's book, and there are a couple copies of his first book as well, and I'm sure they'll be happy to autograph them.
I
Thanks
thought
for
they
coming.
both make good movies.
Yeah.
Matter of fact,
Since one was a screenwriter, yes, both have screenwriter eyes,
How
as
do you
writers.
get your book through filming?
I actually have optioned Stacey's book. I'm a film director and a stage director, and yeah.
So it was an amazing moment to have someone, contact me with such passion about, and
I was excited that I found this book and that I live so close to Stacey, because I live in Marin and she lives in East Bay. So I was just blown away by the writing, and now I want to read this one.
Very
Here's the
powerful.
screenwriter for this
And here's
one.
the screenwriter. You got your package right here.
We have to have coffee.
I could tell that you worked in we'll have to talk more, because I worked in the film business too for years, but I could tell from your reading that how it, the way that
Yeah.
it flew and the visuals that it was very much connected to.
And the build-up.
A filmic eye.
Build-up, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was visualizing both of you
Oh,
Yeah.
great.
without effort, you know.
Oh, I'm glad to hear
Yeah, so it's a long, it's a process to bring it to the screen, especially with the period. It's not like a movie that you do for like $100,000. I mean,
Right.
when you're recreating something like this.
Yeah.
Well, I want to see how you cast Anna, the giantess.
Oh, and I have some great people in mind, but they're different. Yeah, yeah. We always like Laura Dern, but
Yeah,
she's
Laura
not
Dern.
quite. Yeah, she's not quite the right
Yeah.
age, but her face.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Who plays Will? Who plays Will Starling in the movie? He hasn't even thought of this yet.
Well,
Goodness.
yeah, he needs to be very young. He also, Will Starling is, even by the standards at the time, is very small. He's about 4'10".
Oh,
wow.
really? Oh,
Yeah.
he's a small. Oh, a small and a
So,
giant
yeah.
person.
It's Dinklage.
It is.
Dinklage will have to do it.
Exactly. He's a little bit older now, but it's...
He's too tiny. Oh, I don't know. I have to read it.
Oh, how nice.
All right, you guys.
Oh, great.
Thank you so much.